Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? Growing up, I used cassette tapes, but not as much as other people may have. I completely got out of the format in the mid-90s, so it's been quite a while since I last experienced it. And with new music being sold on tapes again, I figured it was time to give it a fresh look. To start my journey, I picked up a Sony WM-R202. This is a Walkman from around 1986, and it was considered a mid-range model at the time. The 202 was a step up from the WM-102, with the added feature of recording capability, though this was useful more for dictation than hi-fi use. But for music playback, this one was considered a solid performer. I bought mine through a Japanese auction. These were sold in the US, but just aren't as common here. This one was advertised as broken, with the only detail that it would try to play a tape, but the tape wouldn't actually move. That may have been a turnoff for some, but for me, there was one thing that made it worth the risk. It's in practically perfect cosmetic condition. No dents, no scratches, no missing parts. Even the tiny clips that hold the battery cage on were still intact. This thing was clearly very well cared for and only has a few small marks that would have come from normal use. And as the auction said, when pressing play, I could hear a whirring sound, but that was it. So then it came down to taking the Walkman apart to see if my hunch was right. I grabbed a JIS number 00 screwdriver and started by removing the volume wheel. From there, I took out the two screws from the side. I printed out the page on disassembly from the service manual and taped the screws to the diagram to make sure they went back where they came from and keep them from getting lost. These screws are tiny. Then there were just two more screws on the back before I could carefully pull off the metal housing. And the problem with this Walkman was quite obvious and thankfully what I was expecting. The belt had gone sticky with age and wrapped itself around one of the pulleys. Luckily, it was still intact. Often these will deteriorate into a tar-like goo that gets everywhere and is a massive pain to clean up. What struck me at this point was how intricate everything was inside. The circuit board is jam-packed with components and wiring, carefully fitting around the mechanical linkage for the tape transport. It's clear this Walkman was expensive to manufacture, especially in 1980s Japan, where a lot of it was assembled by hand. I had ordered a replacement belt from a seller in Slovakia who specializes in them. It was pretty cheap, about $7 US shipped, and it was made specifically for this model. I simply peeled the old belt from the pulleys to remove it, then compared it to the new one. These belts are super thin, and the replacement looked identical, which was a good sign. There was a small amount of sticky residue on some of the pulleys, which I cleaned up with a cotton swab soaked in isopropyl alcohol, something I'll use many more of later on. Then it was a simple matter of fitting the new belt, and I used a pair of tweezers to help get it into place. Before I buttoned up the Walkman, I attached the battery to see if it worked. And to my relief, it did. The mechanical parts of this player are just as impressive as the electronics. The motor, pulleys, gears, and flywheel all work together to advance the tape and change the play direction. It's almost like the cassette equivalent to a mechanical watch, and it's frankly kinda mesmerizing to see in action. Reassembly was, of course, just as straightforward as taking it apart had been, and I'm thankful that the belt was easily accessible. The service manual makes it look like tearing the unit down any further gets really complicated really quick. And sure enough, with the new belt, the reels now turned as they should. But I noticed that some other parts inside needed cleaning. The capstans had what I can only presume was some of the ferric coating from a tape stuck to them, so I got that cleaned up with another cotton swab and alcohol. The rollers looked to be in good condition, but I cleaned them up too, along with the tape head. Obviously, I was eager to test it out, so I dropped in a tape and pressed play, and, well, this is what I got. Obviously, there was something still wrong. All the gears and pulleys seemed to be moving smoothly, so I was confused as to why the wow and flutter was so bad. While I set out to do more research, I figured that leaving a tape playing for a while couldn't hurt. And after half an hour or so, I checked again, and to my surprise, it sounded a lot better. I guess the mechanism just needed some time to start working smoothly again after sitting unused for so long. Now, while having a portable player is great, I also wanted to be able to record tapes too. The recording function of my R202 just doesn't really cut it, so I hit up eBay and bought a home deck. It's a Sony TCWR645S, and it dates back to around 1994. It's much nicer than the deck I had back in the day and features something I never had access to before: top-of-the-line Dolby S noise reduction, which is something we'll get back to in a little bit. But just like the Walkman, both cassette mechanisms had failed due to bad belts, so I ordered a new set and got down to work. Unfortunately, fixing up this deck wasn't nearly as straightforward. Accessing the tape transport mechanisms involved disassembling pretty much the whole unit, since they were attached to the front panel. But once I pulled them out, the problem was quite apparent. Not only had the belts gone bad, they were non-existent. The pulleys were coated with what was left of them, that sticky goo that also ended up on a lot of other parts. I probably spent a solid hour with dozens of cotton swabs and alcohol prep pads to remove as much of the residue as I could. Next, I installed the new belts. There are 2 per tape mechanism. Each goes on one half of the assembly, and Sony thoughtfully included some pegs to stretch them around, which the service manual refers to as claws. After folding the halves back together and clipping them in place, I could then slide the belts off the claws and onto the pulleys. I also took the time to clean the rollers, capstans, and tape heads, though on this deck they were already in pretty good shape. But after getting things buttoned up, well, this happened. That's not good. Yeah, something still wasn't right. I took the deck apart again and confirmed the belts were as they should be. Doing some searching online, I found something that looked promising: advice to refer to the exploded view diagram of the tape transport in the back of the service manual. There's a gear assembly that apparently has to be in a specific position when you put it back together. The manual doesn't call this out, which was frustrating. Sony's service manuals are generally known to be quite good and fairly detailed, even going as far as including not just circuit diagrams, but also the complete parts lists down to the individual components. So I made sure the gears were positioned properly, then reassembled and tested the deck again. And success! Or so I thought. Playing a tape worked, but after a few seconds, a new problem showed up. This pulley at the top began chattering. And when it did, it caused the tape speed to change so bad, in fact, that it ended up eating my test tape. Unfortunately, there wasn't much help online for this particular problem, other than vague references to making sure the belts weren't slipping. So I tore back into it again and cleaned the pulleys again, and despite how much time I originally spent cleaning it, I still managed to get more sticky belt goo out of there. It's crazy how that stuff just got on everything, and these parts being tiny didn't help matters. But finally, after putting it back together one more time, it worked. Tapes played smoothly in both directions on both mechanisms. And speaking of that, you might have noticed that the tape head only has 2 channels, but this is an auto-reversing deck. When switching sides, a small motor physically rotates the head around. It's certainly interesting and clever, but I kinda wonder why Sony did this, when it could have just used a stationary 4-channel head, which is exactly how the auto-reverse on my Walkman does it. Okay, I had the hardware sorted, now it came down to find something to listen to. I hopped back on eBay to pick up some new old stock cassettes of various types. I ended up with some Ferric Type 1 and Chrome Type 2 blanks, a couple of which were the exact same kind that I normally used all those years ago. This lot set me back about $25 with shipping. I was also very generously sent a few pre-recorded tapes by the label Business Casual. If you're into the genres of vaporwave or future funk, you've probably heard of them. They're friends of the channel, and I owe them a big thank you. So how do these different tapes sound? Well, let's check it out. Make sure you're wearing headphones or using good speakers for this part. For this comparison, I'm going to go with what I think are the most common options. Ferric tape with no noise reduction, Chrome tape with Dolby B, and metal Type 4 tapes with Dolby S, since my deck can do that. The first tape was professionally made, and the other two I recorded from a lossless digital source. Have a listen. The Ferric tape with no noise reduction sounds exactly as I remember. Pretty obvious tape hiss with decent bass, but not that great treble. There's a big step up in quality moving to Chrome tape and Dolby B. It just sounds dramatically cleaner. But I'm most impressed by the metal tape with Dolby S. It's not as big of an improvement over Chrome, and I can still kinda hear the limits of the tape, but it's getting awfully close to how the source material sounds. And incidentally, this album by 3D Blast is totally underrated. It's a favorite of mine, and I'll include a link in the description if you want to check it out. So with results like these, why did anyone bother with Ferric tapes if the Chrome or metal ones sounded so much better? Well, it came down to cost. Tape deck manufacturers had to pay to license the Dolby noise reduction technology, so only some of them included it in their products. And blank cassette prices were a big factor too. In the early 90s, a quality Chrome tape like this Maxell cost about $2 US each, while a basic Ferric tape went for under $1. The adoption of metal tape was always quite low because they were quite expensive, selling for upwards of $10 each, not far off from how much a CD sold for. And considering the average consumer doesn't care too much about sound quality in general, that added cost just didn't make sense for most people. Now, just like vinyl records, cassettes have been growing in popularity again over the last few years. So you might be wondering if doing the same thing I did, buying vintage gear and fixing it up, is worth the hassle. For some people, it certainly is. I'm actually amazed by this Walkman. Its design and build quality are just incredible. All the metal panels fit together really well, and it just feels like an expensive, quality product. Perhaps part of why I'm so impressed is because this is an aspect of cassettes that I totally missed out on. I never had a good Walkman, only really cheap plastic knockoffs. That experience partially colored my opinion of cassettes, and I'm happy to admit that this one is proving me wrong. It shows that portable players could have high-end features. This R202 has auto reverse, it can play Chrome and metal tapes, and even features Dolby B. This component deck is really nice too, though it's maybe not quite the marvel of engineering that the Walkman is. It was definitely more complicated to repair and quite frustrating at times, but it offers more features and better sound quality. Now, along those lines, neither of these devices are still 100% perfect functionally. The Walkman plays tapes just fine, but there's something going on with the sound quality. Even after adjusting the azimuth of the head, tapes still sound like the treble's been rolled off a bit. And while the hi-fi deck generally works great, every once in a while it'll spontaneously stop playing. I'm not sure why, but I suspect it's related to that problem with the wobbling pulley. So I guess my point is, if you get into vintage gear, expect a sometimes imperfect experience with the occasional need for repairs. Cassette mechanisms are vastly more complicated than, say, a turntable, so the likelihood of failure is higher. But does that mean you should just buy a new cassette player then? I'd say no. There's really only one manufacturer that still produces cassette mechanisms, and they're not very high-end. Sometimes the devices they're stuffed into are really underwhelming, like portable players that only offer mono sound. New players likely also won't offer any noise reduction because Dolby stopped licensing it years ago. And on top of that, those new players can be overpriced too, if you don't shop around. Now, that's not to say vintage players don't have their cost. Prices are rising with popularity. I paid about $50 shipped for the 645S, plus another $25 or so for the replacement belts. If you bought one that had already been repaired, you'd easily be looking at well over $100. And that's the same for higher-end vintage portable players. My R202 was $120 shipped from Japan, plus another $7 for the belt. Is that a lot of money? Yes, but it was worth it. I'm really happy with the Walkman. I love the design and how solid it feels. And the hi-fi deck was picked because it's from the same lineup of Sony components as the receiver and CD player I had in the 90s. If I had bought a cassette deck to match those back then, this one would have been it. But I didn't. At the time, I was using a hand-me-down, pretty low-end single-well TAC deck. And that plays into why, until now, I've never had a very high opinion of cassettes. Growing up, I really only used tape as kind of a utility format for recording music to listen to on the go. All the tapes I owned were blanks that were recorded to from other formats. But I never really liked cassettes. I simply tolerated them. And looking back, I now realize that was for two reasons. One, of course, was that I used low-end equipment. The sound quality just wasn't very good, and I couldn't realize tape's full potential without spending a lot more money. But the other reason had to do with how we acquired music at the time. Nowadays, we have a whole host of options. Streaming services, file downloads both compressed and lossless, satellite radio, hell, even CDs are still being sold. But in the 80s and 90s, consumers were pretty much limited to just a couple of physical formats and the radio. Vinyl records gave way to CDs around the turn of the decade for home listening, and cassettes were the de facto option for portable use. Pre-recorded music cost way more in equivalent terms back then. The average selling price for a CD in 2019 is, what, 12 to 14 bucks? And in 1990, it was 12 to 14 bucks. But accounting for inflation, that's almost $24 to $28 now. Long story short, I always felt that if I was going to spend that kind of money on music, I should get the best quality I could. Pre-recorded tapes weren't all that much cheaper, so I basically went straight from vinyl to CD. These days, though, I've started to think of these physical formats in a different way. They're not necessary anymore, and music is so accessible and relatively inexpensive that they've gone from being just a music delivery method to a way of delivering an experience. Ferric tape with no noise reduction sounds just as bad as I remember, but nostalgia sets in to fill in the gaps, and suddenly they take on a charm of their own. Tapes are also a great way to support artists you like, especially independent ones or smaller labels. because the barrier to entry in producing them is low, and you end up with this tangible artifact of music you enjoy. And if that part is really what you're after, a music listening experience instead of a repair odyssey like I went on, then here's the best suggestion I can offer on what player to buy. Look for a basic portable player from the 90s made by a major brand. This Sony WM-EX10 is nothing fancy. It has mechanical transport controls, no auto reverse, no noise reduction, it's made of plastic and feels kinda cheap, it's twice as thick as my R202, and doesn't have even half the aesthetic appeal. But it's from a time when cassettes were still taken seriously. So even though it only cost me 20 bucks, it still works, and sounds just like it was new. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram @thisdoesnotcomp, and as always, thanks for watching.